America's current leadership has actually told us why they're implementing this trade and economic policy. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this quote. We were at our richest from 1870 to 1913. That's when we were a tariff country. There is so much to unpack from those two sentences. The funny thing about this quote is that from 1870 to 1913, only Congress had the power to tariff other countries. It wasn't until 1934, during the Great Depression, under the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where the president was able to enact emergency powers to tariff. And in 1974, under President Nixon, that ability got turbocharged. It was during that time that the United States was primarily a backwater that was just a major producer and manufacturer. The federal government was able to fund itself back in the day because there were zero social safety nets. There was no such thing as Social Security or the highway system. There was little to no access to public education and public health. Like I said, the United States was a backwater back then. But there is more to why our president justified us being at our strongest and wealthiest from 1870 to 1913. That period of time, known as the Gilded Age, was an era of untold wealth for the American industrial magnates. Back then, the wealthiest 10% of Americans owned 75% of the country's wealth, while today, the top 10% control 60%. The average household income for an entire family back in those times was $1,200, which is equivalent to about $37,000 today. The average wage per person was $380 per year, which is about $12,000 today. And remember, 40 to 50% of wages back then was spent just on food. Compare that to 15% today. So the bottom 90% were at the complete and total mercy of big industry back then. And remember, that year, 1913, is very important because that was when the Federal Reserve was established. And there's all kinds of crazy conspiracies about how terrible the US Federal Reserve is, but I've noticed since the implementation of that organization, there has been a vast redistribution of wealth to the middle class. It was also, finally, the government's instrument to take away the power of our country's money from the top 1%. And while there was a Great Depression in 1929, 16 years after the establishment of the Federal Reserve, before 1913, we averaged one depression, huge depression, per decade. And I know it sounds very idyllic that the control of our money should be in the hands of the individual. But you guys forget, if it's not the Federal Reserve that has control over your money, it's the billionaires. And it's the billionaires pushing our politicians to grant them more tax avoidance that has put America in the financial crap hole. And of course, the icing on the cake during the Gilded Age was that there was no federal income tax and there was no corporate income tax to pay until 1909. The state and local taxes were next to nothing. And it was the tariffs during this time that protected all of these American sectors. And that is what this administration is trying to push America back into. In fact, this has been a campaign for maybe 40 or 50 years. At first, when our current administration took this trade policy, I thought it was to stir a lot of economic calamity in order to force the Federal Reserve to drop interest rates to zero. And the reason for doing so was that our government wanted to refinance the $7 to $9 trillion of our debt coming into maturity this year. Usually, when interest rates are that low, the cost of paying interest for US Treasury bonds drops to 0.5%, 1%. So if the United States could issue $9 trillion of new debt paying only 1%, that significantly drops the amount of interest we have to pay on our current debt, which is about $900 billion a year. It was reckless, but I could see the effectiveness of it. But I think that was a maybe for this administration. It was part of a larger goal, a dismissible part of a larger goal. Because if our government actually wanted to drop the interest rates for Treasury bonds, we would not have alienated the world with an increase of 10% duties baseline, along with 145% against China and 25% against Canada, and a bunch of other ones that have been put on pause for 90 days. Generally, when the value of the dollar drops, that can actually be good for America because it means our exports become that much more appealing to the rest of the world. But because the United States has alienated most of the world, we are facing trade barriers, especially from three very large economies: China, the European Union, and then Canada. It's like, what, the 10th largest or 12th largest economy. But it's still, these are major trade barriers that will harm our ability to export and offset the damage caused by a weaker currency. It will also harm our ability to import because our dollar is cheaper. And because we've upset so many countries, we know for a fact that China and Japan have put tens of billions, if not hundreds of billions of dollars of US Treasury bonds onto the market. So our ability to export is weakened. The amount of interest payments we may have to pay for our debt will skyrocket. And it's not the uber rich that are going to be suffering from this. It is the bottom 90 to 95% of people. The poor, the middle class, low-key investors, even mid-range investors will suffer. And it very well may reset the American economy to the Gilded Age standards. So if we start tipping deeply into recession, yes, there will be fiscal stimulus, and yes, there will be money printing, but the vast bulk of that is going to go up to the top 5 and 10%, and we will start to see that 60% of total wealth in the United States going to that 10%, it will become 65% or even 70%. And that puts the bottom 90 to 95% of people at severe risk. Again, I don't think it's 100% going to happen, but it's more likely that we will see our purchasing power drop. If our ability to import and export is hampered enough, that will harm our manufacturing and our services industry. That will result in more unemployment. And if our current administration is really trying to get us back into the Gilded Age, to them that's a good thing because it makes us more desperate for any kind of work and any kind of income. And when unemployment goes up, then consumer sentiment drops and consumer spending goes the same direction, downwards a lot. How would there be new manufacturing and new services and industries growing if there is massive unemployment? And I don't see how our manufacturing industry can stay as robust as it is if this is allowed to happen. What will happen to our car manufacturers? What will happen to the unions? For all we know, the magnates want the unions to start falling apart, especially in the automotive sector. If that happens, they will most likely level our current automotive industry and rebuild it from the ground up to possibly compete with Chinese, Japanese, and other European cars. And I will bet you that these automotive workers will be earning less money than the current union workers today. And I just remember during COVID when all the very wealthy people and celebrities were very upset that Americans were resigning and not going back to work. And they kept saying, oh, you just need a job. Oh, you're too entitled. Well, maybe this is their attempt to rebalance this sense of entitlement. But I want to conclude this post with a question for all of you. Who do you think should have the power over the United States money supply? The Federal Reserve, a fairly disinterested third party that actually regulates what our banks do, or the multi-billionaires who have habitually shown that they do not care about the American consumer, they do not care about small businesses. They only care about tax avoidance, lining their own pockets, and gaining more influence. I am the Geo Hussar. Let's move forward, not backward. Thanks for watching.